Hello everyone. Before we start, I have an important announcement to make. As long-time viewers know, on this show we like to make a little fun of our old friend K. Shanmugam. This rivalry, of course, stems from the Select Committee of 2018 when I first embarrassed him, and ever since then he's tried to destroy me. But lately it's been feeling kind of one-sided, Despite all of our commentary, all of our jokes, he's not responded. No POFMA, no lawsuits, no attacks in the press. I guess Shan's moved on, and maybe it's time for us to move on too and end this rivalry. So I guess no more Shanmugam jokes. What?
It should be a useful read, at least for some people. So my views would provide a data point, a perspective for a future historian.
Wow, an exchange with Dr. Thum Ping Jin. He devotes an entire chapter to attacking me. Ooh, and he attacks me in a different chapter too. And I'm mentioned more often in this book than Lawrence Wong and Tharman combined. I knew he could. But you guys know what this means, right? The rivalry is back! Game on, baby! This is the show with PJ Thum! Welcome to the final episode of Season 2 of the show. A lot of you have asked me about the Albatross File Exhibition at the National Library and all the new documents which have been released about Singapore's separation from Malaysia. The government has trumpeted that the declassified documents change our understanding of Singapore's history. And the crazy thing is, they actually do. But the equally crazy thing is, none of those revelations are reflected in the exhibition. On the contrary, so much history is left out, so much is omitted, that the exhibition is deeply misleading, dangerously incomplete. The exhibition is very well designed, but it is very bad history. These omissions matter because they significantly change how we understand the events of 1963 to 65. And in particular, there are three major omissions. 1. Why merger happened in the first place. 2. Why Malaysia was designed to discriminate against Singaporeans. And 3. How Lee Kuan Yew's actions before and during Malaysia led to the creation of Malaysia, but also to its collapse. Without these three omissions, merger is presented like a pragmatic necessity, and separation looks like an unfortunate accident, and Lee Kuan Yew looks like a statesman merely reacting to other people's mistakes. Boring. And also, not true. In the story of Malaysia, Lee Kuan Yew is the protagonist.
I'm the protagonist.
Yeah, that guy. Lee Kuan Yew was the prime motivator of all the major events of Malaysia from 1961 to 65. He was the person responsible for the creation of Malaysia. He was responsible for the conflicts in it. He was responsible for its failure. He created all that mess, always purposefully for a bigger aim, a political purpose. But instead, the exhibition just leaves all this out. It makes merger and separation seem inevitable, pragmatic, natural, when in fact, they were deeply contested political choices, argued over, even within the PAP cabinet. The exhibition strips out these trade-offs and arguments and gives us this neat, sanitized story. And I think this is deliberate. The exhibition wants to make Lee look like a statesman. It wants to burnish Lee's legacy. But to do so, it has to ignore all the new declassified documents and all the new interesting revelations about Lee. Why? Because the same qualities which made him great, his political skill, his strategic brilliance, his audacity, opportunism, manipulativeness, obsessiveness, selfishness, his willingness to gamble with thousands of lives in pursuit of his aims, also produced the conditions of his failure. And because the exhibition cannot talk about his failure, it cannot talk about his greatness. The Lee Kuan Yew that emerges from the Albatross Files is a man who is ultimately brought down by his own hubris. It's like a Greek tragedy with Lee as our tragic hero. Our best heroes are heroes because they are human. They did not succeed because they were perfect. They succeeded in spite of, by overcoming massive human failings. We respect them for that. We learn from those stories. It's why Batman is always a more compelling story than Superman. But the exhibition can't say this, so it strips Lee of his agency. It makes him seem smaller, lesser than he actually was. And we learn the wrong things from this story. That's the irony of the exhibition. In trying to make Lee seem good, it airbrushes out everything which made Lee great. And love him or hate him, Lee Kuan Yew deserves so much better than that. Once we add back in what was left out, we end up with a far more uncomfortable, but far more compelling, far more interesting, far more educational Singapore history. And I think the exhibition is a lost opportunity because our story of separation actually centers on a fascinating dilemma, which is this. If you could turn Malaysia, including Singapore, into a multi-ethnic democracy in which every citizen has equal rights and dignity and respect, how many people would you be willing to kill for the chance to make that happen? That is the central question of our separation from Malaysia. And once you understand all of that, you also understand the one mystery that the exhibition presents, which was highlighted by former Prime Minister Lee Hsien Loong in his opening speech.
Decades later, when Mr. Lee was preparing his memoirs, he obtained Dr. Goh's permission to read his oral history. It was only then that Mr. Lee discovered that, contrary to his instructions, Dr. Goh had, from the start, gone for a clean break and never tried for the looser federation which Mr. Lee preferred and had instructed him to try for. Mr. Lee was so astonished that he made a note of the exact time, date, and place where he first learned this.
Why did Goh Keng Swee go behind Lee Kuan Yew's back to propose separation to Razak, rather than the looser rearrangement that Lee wanted, and then trick Lee into accepting separation as a fait accompli? One big caveat before we start. I went to the National Archives to actually look at the two Albatross files. Only around 107 out of 309 pages from the two files are declassified. Basically, only 1/3. So there could still be things in there that completely change how we understand separation, which are not declassified. I think the government should just declassify everything. It's been over 60 years. We deserve to know the truth. Now, I won't have time to cover everything in this episode, so if you want to know more, I wrote this book. It's very short, hopefully readable, and available to purchase at the link in the description below. Why did merger happen in 1961? The exhibition says the idea of merger was first contemplated in 1961 and that merger was the route to independence and survival. But the more important truth is that by 1961, the PAP were in serious trouble. Its popularity was cratering. The government was bleeding support because Prime Minister Lee Kuan Yew had failed to keep promises made during the election and moved away from their party platform. The PAP had failed to address the most important issues like jobs, housing, education, and crime, and the party was internally consumed by conflict. This cratering in popularity was underlined by the massive loss in the Hong Lim by-election in April 1961 when Ong Eng Guan crushed the PAP, humiliating the government and signalling that the PAP could not assume it would win the next election. But Lee Kuan Yew refused to change, and instead he forced out his main critics and rivals within the party. Lim Chin Siong and his allies then formed the Barisan Socialists, taking with them a majority of the PAP membership and much of its organizing machinery. Lee was desperate. He needed a decisive issue he could actually deliver, something that could restore his authority and momentum before the next election. But what? You can't turn the economy around overnight, or build enough housing overnight, or solve crime overnight. But you can achieve reunification with the Federation of Malaya overnight if Kuala Lumpur and London agree. And reunification was something really emotionally resonant. Since the partition of Malaya in 1946, families were split across 2 British colonies. Reunification was a popular aspiration on both sides of the causeway. So Lee realized he had a powerful wedge issue. If he could dictate the terms of reunification, he could force his rivals into a lose-lose choice. Either support reunification on Lee's terms, or be painted as opposing reunification itself. So Lee charged madly into merger. He fast-talked his way into getting Federation Prime Minister Tunku Abdul Rahman and the British government to agree to merger in a matter of months. In March 1961, reunification was still widely seen as a decade, 10 years away. But by May 1961, reunification suddenly became urgent, imminent, on the table. And after intense negotiations in August 1961, Lee and the Tunku announced a version of reunification called merger, in which Singaporeans would be second-class citizens within a merged Malaya with fewer political rights and underrepresentation in the federal parliament. Singaporeans were naturally really shocked by the proposal. One clue was the name. Instead of creating a new country where you wipe away the previous 4 territories and create one single new country, Malaysia was a merger of 4 territories into a federation. And the 4 territories would still have separate status within the new entity. North Borneo, which became Sabah, and Sarawak, and Singapore, all had different rules, and to this day, Sabah and Sarawak operate under different rules from the 11 states of the former Federation of Malaya. And Singapore's rules were the worst, the most discriminatory compared to Sabah and Sarawak's. Singapore's opposition Barisan Socialist, led by Lim Chin Siong, naturally said, "That's ridiculous. It won't work. If you create a country where one group of people are permanently inferior, are constitutionally bound to be inferior, you will never be able to build one nation. If you write a constitution that explicitly discriminates against some people, those people will forever be fighting to change the constitution. You will never have peace." And this is not just looking back. The fragility of this arrangement was visible in real time. At that time, critics at the time already argued it wouldn't work. Not just politicians like Lim, but smart people like Tommy Koh, then a law student at UM, pointed out how problematic the whole arrangement was. The fact is, throughout history, such situations where you have 2 classes of citizens in one country with one class systematically discriminated against always ends in violence. It's like living in a house where you're only treated like family if you stay in your room. The moment you step out of your room, you are treated like a stranger in the rest of your own home. That's not a problem you can solve by moving the sofa around. Can you? Hello! Today we have a letter from a Mr. Harry Lee about the feng shui of his new house. He says, "We have a house with 12 rooms, but the British picked up the door to my room even though it is the biggest room. Now I want to open it back up so the house can function as one home again. But the man who controls the other 11 rooms says he will only agree to reopen this door if I stay in my room. And even after the door is open, I cannot move freely through the rest of the house. I cannot help decide how the whole house is run. And even though I am supposedly part of the household, my room counts for less when it comes to household decisions. Even the fella in the Kelantan room counts for more than me." So my question is, how can we rearrange the furniture to have good energy? Harry, the problem is not with the furniture. The problem is with your lease agreement. You see, first, it makes the chi flow terrible. If you say this is one house, then stop people moving naturally through the space, then the chi cannot circulate. It gets trapped. It gets stagnant. Second, everything has to go through the political center, but not everyone has equal access. This means resentment will accumulate. In feng shui, if the center is too strong, the whole structure becomes unstable. Third, your command position is all wrong. The people in your room are affected by decisions made in the rest of the house, but they cannot properly see or control the door through which those decisions enter. Fourth, the HRT everywhere. All this hostility directed at one room. Of course there will be conflict. So you can add a rug, you can add some lamps, you can move furniture around, but it won't do anything because the problem is not the furniture, the problem is the house rules. If this is truly one household, then everyone in the household must have equal dignity, equal respect, and equal access to the shared space. Then you have good feng shui. So, now you know. The problem is that Lee needs merger to win the election, so he ignores all the critics pointing out all the problems and tells Singaporeans, "Trust me, it'll be fine. Don't worry." He uses merger as an excuse to arrest all his political opponents, enabling him to win the 1963 Singapore elections. But once in Malaysia, he quickly realizes that his critics were right. Singaporeans are effectively second-class citizens in Malaysia, including him. So he launches his campaign to overturn all the restrictions that have been placed upon Singapore. Looking back, the then director of Special Branch, George Bogas, was one of the many in the establishment who had ignored Lim Chin Siong, and he later said to his regret that Lim was right and they should have listened to him. If you want to know more about the battle for merger, I covered it all in my previous book, Nationalism and Decolonization in Singapore. So, there are two questions here. First, why did the Tunku not agree? Why did he oppose a straightforward reunification where everyone just comes together and makes one new country? And second, why, when he finally agreed, did he only agree to this strange, discriminatory version of reunification? Because Malaysia was designed to quarantine Singapore. The exhibition tells you Malaysia was a security solution. The Tunku feared a communist Singapore and wanted control from Kuala Lumpur. But again, that leaves out a lot. It wasn't just communists, it was all of us. Malaysia's discriminatory design was built around a fear of Singaporeans. Specifically, the fear that Singaporeans, if allowed to campaign or vote north of the causeway, if they could cross over into the rest of the house and be treated as equals, would transform Malaya's electoral arithmetic and threaten UMNO's Malay First nationalist project. That is why Tunku Abdul Rahman was dead set against straightforward reunification. It was electoral calculation. Just look at this chart. In the 1959 Federation elections, the three alliance parties of UMNO, MCA and MIC won 51.77% of the vote, a majority, with the non-alliance votes divided between smaller parties. But when you add in Singapore's elections from the same year, the alliance parties of both Singapore and the Federation added together only win just over 40% of the vote. So why would the leader of UMNO want Singapore voters if it means he might lose power? He won't. It's simple electoral math. So how do you get Malaysia at all? You build a structure that incorporates Singapore while containing it. The proposed terms explicitly quarantine Singapore from Federation politics, separate political citizenships, separate voting rights, reduce parliamentary representation for Singapore. Basically, you stay in your room, no problem. But isn't it easier then to just not reunite? Why did Tunku even agree to merger then? This is where we see some of Lee Kuan Yew's brilliance and his amorality. He basically fast talks everyone, the British, the Tunku, his colleagues, into agreeing to merger by telling them that he is on the verge of losing power to the communists, even though he knows it is not true. Because Lee Kuan Yew, as he described in his autobiography, is the one in a secret alliance with the Malayan Communist Party, not the Barisan. So he scares the Tunku. But to get the Tunku to the point where the Tunku agrees, Lee has to go beyond just saying, "Oh, I might lose an election." He actually tells the Tunku and UMNO leaders that Singapore's Chinese cannot be trusted. Lee Kuan Yew says we must be contained and controlled, and the only way to do that is to incorporate them into Malaysia. He throws us under the bus. But having made those arguments, he then is forced to concede important rights. Lee cannot argue that Singapore's Chinese are disloyal and untrustworthy and then also say, yeah, give them equal rights and freedom of movement. Right? That'd be contradictory. So to get the Tunku to say yes, Lee has to concede two things he would later really regret and try to overturn. First, he agrees Malaysia will be a Malay first country. And second, that Singapore politics must stay in Singapore. And these are the two red lines which would make collision inevitable. And agreeing to these would be Lee Kuan Yew's biggest mistake. These are the two issues which would drive separation, because the moment he got into Malaysia, he would seek to overturn both principles to the Tunku's fury. Now, one question which has divided historians is, did Lee Kuan Yew know these concessions would be huge mistakes? I used to think Lee knew they were mistakes, but he chose to accept them because he needed merger to save himself, so he made the trade-off for short-term gain against long-term pain, having confidence in his own ability to overturn them later. But in the new declassified documents, Lee actually states that he totally underestimated the strength of Malay nationalism and cultural pride. Lee admits that it simply never occurred to him that UMNO was that serious about Malay supremacy until after Malaysia was created and he encountered it for himself. And this is corroborated by his close colleagues like Toh Chin Chye, Goh Keng Swee and Maurice Baker, who all agree Lee simply didn't understand the Malays. See, in a nutshell, to Lee, culture was something you mold in order to then create a strong and prosperous country. I talked about that in the last episode, Season 2, Episode 8, which is why Lee subsequently would repeatedly redefine Chinese culture in Singapore in ways which were radically different from culture in China, with the goal of making us good workers. But UMNO aimed to create a strong and prosperous Malaysia in order to protect Malay culture. Completely the opposite. So to UMNO, Malaya had been repeatedly colonized by Europeans, and so to prevent that from ever happening again, they wanted to guarantee Malay supremacy. So in other words, to put it crudely, UMNO, in order to prevent themselves from ever being colonized again, decided they had to be the colonizers, and that ethno-nationalist Malay supremacist project remains true today. And according to all his colleagues, Lee simply didn't get that. So he made the concessions, agreeing that Malaysia would be a Malay-first country without fully understanding what he was agreeing to. And he also didn't ask the advice of his cabinet colleagues who were born north of the Causeway, who might have been able to tell him what it meant. Toh Chin Chye, who was born in Taiping, said that the rest of the cabinet were kept in the dark and that it was, quote, a very great surprise, unquote, that Lee agreed to Malay special rights as a condition of merger. Toh calls it a tragic mistake. Likewise, the commitment for Singapore to stay out of the politics of the rest of Malaysia. This is the closest the exhibition comes to an outright lie, because there was no mutual gentleman's agreement. The agreement was only for the PAP to stay in Singapore and out of the rest of Malaysia. Lee's colleagues explicitly affirmed this. For example, both in his 1981 oral history interview and in his 1996 interview, Goh Keng Swee recalled the Tunku's position from their very first meeting over merger in August 1961 was that, quote, he did not want the PAP to have any activities in the peninsula, unquote.
As a condition either of coexistence or cooperation, it was a fundamental condition that the PAP would not move into the Malay world.
And at a subsequent interview in 1982, Goh explicitly says that Lee's position in 1964 was that there was no agreement. This is corroborated by Ong Pang Boon that the agreement was one-sided, that Lee denied any agreement existed. The only person who says that there was a gentleman's agreement was Lee Kuan Yew. Everyone else in the PAP cabinet says, look, we understand the Tunku does not want us in the rest of Malaysia, but it is unfair that UMNO can campaign in Singapore and we can't campaign north of the Causeway, which is a different argument from saying that there was some sort of gentleman's agreement. What's also missing from the exhibition is that the Parti Rakyat and Labour Party of the Federation, who were running together as the Socialist Front, had been steadily making gains in Malaysia. And so, according to Fong Sip Chee, the PAP-CEC were terrified that if they did not take part in the 1964 federal elections, those two parties would make gains and the PAP's role as the leading socialist party of Malaysia would be usurped even before the PAP had a chance to make its case to voters. So they knew the red line. But the PAP ministers very reasonably thought that this was unfair, so they went ahead to participate in the 1964 federal elections, not anticipating how angry the Tunku would be, perhaps because, as the British were later shocked to find out, Lee had not told his cabinet the extent to which he had pledged to confine the PAP's activities to Singapore. But this red line shows us the problematic nature of Malaysia and how it was untenable. How can you have one country exist with two separate governments? The federal government is supposed to govern the whole country, so how can they not participate in Singapore politics? And the Singapore government is supposed to represent the interests of Singapore to the rest of the country, so how can they not take part in federal politics? It makes no sense. But again, all this was ignored in the rush to merger, so naturally when Lee breaks the agreement, the Tunku is really angry. Let's check back in with our feng shui master. Hello! Today we have a letter from Tunku Abdul Rahman about his housemate. He says, I only agreed to knock down the wall on two conditions. First, Harry has to stay in his room. Second, he has to remember that I am the landlord and he is a guest in this house. Now Harry is walking around the whole house saying every room must be equal. He wants to rewrite the house rules. What can I do to restore the peace and harmony of this house? Tunku, this is very bad feng shui. You wanted the benefits of a big house with the hierarchy of a small house. Very unrealistic. See, the problem is that the house was designed to contain Harry's politics, and now Harry is attacking the very logic of the house. So from your point of view, this is not a misunderstanding. This is containment failure. Because you cannot design a house to include someone and then permanently confine them. Either everyone in the house is equal, or the arrangement will keep breaking down. You cannot say, welcome to the family. Now, please remain in your room forever. The chi will revolt. So, from your point of view, there are only two options. Either you agree with Harry and you change the house rules, or you get rid of Harry forever. So, now you know. So this is the second omission of the exhibition. Malaysia was not a country of equals. It was a country in which Singaporeans were explicitly second-class citizens, a country which was explicitly designed to quarantine Singapore. Look at it from UMNO's perspective. They created Malaysia as a favour to Lee, to save his political career. In exchange, Lee agreed Singapore's politics would stay in Singapore and that Malaysia would be a Malay-first country. But the ink on the Malaysia agreement is barely dry when Lee and the PAP crossed the causeway and entered the 1964 federal elections. And so naturally, UMNO sees this as a massive betrayal of everything they had agreed to in creating Malaysia. That's why UMNO was so angry. That's why the conflicts of 1964 were so bitter. And this is why violence erupted in the riots. The exhibition does not explain any of this. The documents reveal that the July 1964 riots were an attempt by UMNO's Malay supremacists to discipline Singapore, to show that if you don't behave, we will beat up your people. Lee notes that this is what UMNO did in Penang in the 1950s when the MCA got more assertive. And Goh argues that Razak admitted to giving the go-ahead for the riots, not realizing how bad they would get. According to the official PAP story, on that day of the riots, agents provocateur from Kuala Lumpur started beating up PAP supporters. But the police are controlled by Kuala Lumpur, so they do nothing. Then when PAP supporters fight back, the police then use that violence as an excuse to beat up the PAP supporters and arrest them. And Lee and Goh realize to their horror there is nothing they can do because they no longer control the police. They no longer control Singapore's internal security. And as they are underrepresented in the federal parliament and have no representation in the cabinet, Singapore has effectively become a quasi-colony of Kuala Lumpur. And when they try to renegotiate Singapore's status afterwards, they specifically make that argument that Singapore is a quasi-colony. Lim Chin Siong tried to warn them of this in 1961, but they wouldn't listen. How did Chin Siong know? Because that's how the British used the police against the PAP in 1956 to 57, and that's how Lee Kuan Yew used the police against the Barisan in 1961 to 63, both times leading to the arrest of Chin Siong and his colleagues. Both those times the police were on Lee Kuan Yew's side, so he was fine with it. But in 1964, the police were against Lee, and suddenly he's all like, oh wait, police brutality, police bias, unfair. See, a gun looks very different depending on which end of it you're facing, right? So the exhibition presents the racial antipathy as arising from the political rivalry between Singapore and Kuala Lumpur after the 1964 elections, but in reality this was a feature, not a bug, of Malaysia from the very beginning. To put it another way, it's like the Empire Strikes Back. Tunku agreed to merger on two explicit conditions: Malaysia is a Malay-first country and Singapore politics stays in Singapore. And to the PAP cabinet, that is unfair.
Perhaps you think you're being treated unfairly?
No.
Good. It would be unfortunate if I had to leave a garrison here.
This deal is getting worse all the time.
So the PAP cabinet think they are Lando Calrissian. They enter federal politics. But now from the UMNO leadership's point of view, Lee Kuan Yew is the one changing the deal.
I am altering the deal. Pray I don't alter it any further.
In other words, Tunku thinks he's Lando. Lee Kuan Yew thinks he is Lando. Both sides think they are the good guy. And that is exactly the problem. Lee Kuan Yew bears primary responsibility for both the creation and failure of Malaysia. And that's why Lee Kuan Yew is the protagonist of Malaysia. This is perhaps the most significant omission of the exhibition. The story of Malaysia from 1961 to 65 is Lee Kuan Yew's story. He drives everything. Yet in the exhibition, all of that is left out. Worse, it makes him seem passive and reactive and unable to control the situation. That's not Lee Kuan Yew. He's devious. He's a schemer. He has plans within plans. So, after forming Malaysia, he wants to overturn the discrimination against Singapore. So his first plan is straightforward. The PAP should win enough seats to eventually replace the MCA in the governing coalition. So the first step, win a few seats in the April 1964 federal elections. Just a few itsy-bitsy, teensy-wincy seats. Just a little foothold north of the causeway. But the backlash from UMNO to that is huge and leads to the July 1964 riots. The violence then sobers everyone up. There's a temporary truce, but the truce cannot last because Malaysia is too contradictory. Conflict erupts again because of money. The federal government needs money to fund the enormous cost of fighting confrontasi against Indonesia, so it tries to increase the tax on Singapore way beyond what was agreed during the merger negotiations. Basically, should Singapore pay for a proportionate equal share of the cost of Malaysia? Malaysia Finance Minister Tan Siew Sin says yes. But if Singapore is going to pay for an equal share, then Singapore should also have equal representation in the parliament, right? No taxation without representation. So Singapore says, you want us to pay? We should have equality. But of course, to that, the Tunku and Razak say, no, we do not want Singapore to have equality. So there's a quandary. So to get out of this quandary, Lee and the Tunku seek to renegotiate Singapore's status within Malaysia, and they come to a very general agreement and might have reached a specific rearrangement, except that is blocked by the British. The British are deeply invested in Malaysia's status quo. They fear that if Singapore renegotiates, Sabah and Sarawak will renegotiate and the whole federation may unravel. So they are firm.
No renegotiations.
As you wish.
And the Tunku cannot go against them because the British are paying for most of Malaysia's defense against confrontasi, against Indonesia. The British effectively still have a veto even though on paper Malaysia is an independent country because the British are what stands between Malaysia becoming part of Indonesia. And this is where Lee has his epiphany. This is where Lee's brilliance as a politician really shows. He reads the situation. He understands political power. He makes a series of predictions which all come true. Lee lays it all out in two memoranda from July 1964 and January 1965. It's in the exhibition book. We did not know this before, but now we know, thanks to the Singapore government, for declassifying some documents. Hey, Larry, please declassify the rest of the documents. Don't just give us drips and drabs, please. Okay, anyway, here's Lee's logic. First, Lee reasons the British are blocking Singapore from disengaging from the rest of Malaysia, right? No renegotiation. So Singapore must work within the current arrangement, which means Singapore has two choices. One, accept Malay supremacy and a second-class status for non-Malays, or two, fight for equality and brace for a violent response from the Malay supremacists. So either the PAP walk away from their dream of a multiracial socialist Malaysia or accept that violence is inevitable. Now, as a student of history, Lee knows that a discriminated minority will always fight for their rights. In many countries, the minority are too few and too weak to achieve equality. But in a Malaysia that includes Singapore, non-Malays outnumber Malays. Given that Malay supremacy is non-negotiable to UMNO, then the inevitable conclusion is that eventually, in the long term, there will be a violent reckoning. And Lee would turn out to be right. In Malaysia, this is known as 13th May 1969. Okay, so violence is inevitable. And if violence is inevitable, Lee argues, then we should use it to our advantage. And so, Lee's strategy was to present the UMNO leaders with a dilemma. Knowing the Malay extremists would respond with violence, he would deliberately provoke them into a violent overreaction, which would then send the country into chaos. Then UMNO's moderate leaders like the Tunku or Dr Ismail would then be forced to choose between supporting the violence, which would destabilize Malaysia and risk its failure and potentially absorption by Indonesia, or restrain the extremists, which would defang UMNO and open up the way to a multi-ethnic Malaysia. Either way, UMNO would lose their primacy, and he spelled out this strategy explicitly in the January 1965 memo. But this plan relies on confrontasi. As long as confrontasi is happening, there is a real risk of Malaysia being conquered by Indonesia. Remember, Indonesia conquered the Republic of South Maluku in 1950. It crushed the Aceh independence movement from 1953 to 59. It crushed rebellions in Makassar, including Permesta in 1961, and it conquered and colonized West Papua via Operation Trikora in 1962. An Indonesian conquest of at least the Borneo states, if not all of Malaysia, was well within the realm of possibility, if not for Britain's defense of the territories. And that defense is what gives Lee leverage. If confrontasi were not happening and non-Malays fought for equality, UMNO would simply have them beaten up and arrested and detained without trial because they control the police and the military. But because confrontasi is happening, because the British insist on stability, because the British say no renegotiation, so Lee calculates they will block all destabilizing actions, and this includes mass arrests of opposition politicians, which means that Lee has free rein to campaign for equality for Singapore as long as confrontasi lasts. But confrontasi will not last forever. Confrontasi is unsustainable. Both Indonesia and Britain were spending huge amounts of resources to fight confrontasi, and it would surely end soon. And again, Lee would be right. Confrontasi comes to a de facto end by the end of 1965, after the 30th September 1965 incident, which led to Sukarno's fall from power. So, Lee needs to trigger the violence as soon as possible. And so, after the renegotiation of Singapore's status collapses in February 1965, Lee goes into all-out attack. It's a plan of supreme brinkmanship. Imagine gambling on the destruction of your whole country just for a chance at racial equality. The balls of this guy, am I right? So, why is this not in the exhibition? Because of Lee's tactics, and because he ultimately fails. See, Lee needs the violence now. So in his desperation to trigger the Malay supremacists and force UMNO's moderate leadership into a dilemma, Lee goes way overboard. He tries to provoke the Malay extremists by making speeches attacking everything they hold dear. He becomes more and more ridiculously provocative and eventually descends into blatant racialism and racism. From March to July 1965, Lee spends the whole time just continuing to pour petrol on a raging inferno. Lee basically attacks the entire Malay supremacist psyche and attacks UMNO's right to rule. He argues the Chinese culture is superior to Malay culture, saying that the Chinese are a product of a civilization which has gone through all its ups and downs, but Malays are a product of warm sunshine and bananas and coconuts. He even uses dubious science to argue that the Malays aren't even the native people of Malaya. Lee outright says Malaysia would be better off if the non-Malays are running the country. And he even suggests that Singapore, Sabah and Sarawak should secede and seek to convince Penang, Malacca and maybe even Johor to come with them, which at the time was considered sedition. If anyone else had said this, they would have gotten arrested in a heartbeat. Many other politicians had previously been arrested for saying a lot less than Lee. Everything he said would be illegal in Singapore today under the Sedition Act and the Maintenance of Racial Harmony Act. And the exhibition goes out of its way to hide this. For example, the exhibition highlights the famous speech in the Dewan Rakyat from 27th May 1965, which Lee gives about 10% of the speech in flawless Malay. But what it doesn't show is that as the speech goes on, Lee increasingly goes off the rails, and by the end he is completely racist. And that's why I think we can only see the first 2 pages of the speech in the exhibition, but not the rest of it. And Lee is not alone. Toh Chin Chai and Rajaratnam also support him, and they utilize the entire Singapore government machinery to conduct this all-out propaganda campaign highlighting how inferior UMNO is and how backward Malays are under UMNO rule. And to a certain extent, it does work. The UMNO extremists, the Malay supremacists, they go absolutely crazy and they condemn Lee and they publicly attack him and they demand Lee be arrested for sedition. And that's why we have the chaos of March to July 1965. That's the strategy. That's why Malaysia became so violent. Lee was not some passive observer during these events, as the exhibition shows. He was the principal driver of Malaysia's descent into violent chaos. It was his plan, his strategy. He was the prime motivator, the prime actor. And despite all the anger and the fury and the death threats, Lee just kept raising the stakes. It's simply amazing. And ultimately, the exhibition cannot show this, not just because it's racist and illegal, but because if they explain Lee's political brilliance, his insight, his boldness, they also have to explain his racism, his tactics, and they have to explain why he failed. So, why did he fail? Why did Goh Keng Swee defy Lee Kuan Yew to negotiate for separation behind his back? So, we come back to the one interesting fact that the exhibition does actually highlight. Why did Goh Keng Swee go behind Lee Kuan Yew's back to propose separation to Razak rather than the looser rearrangement Lee wanted and then present it to Lee as a fait accompli? Once you know the whole context of merger and separation, you can understand what Dr. Goh was thinking. First, for Dr. Goh, Malaysia was already pointless.
I've had enough of Malaysia. I just want to get out. I could see no future in it. The political cost was dreadful, and the economic benefits, well, didn't exist. So it was an exercise of futility. It's a project that should be abandoned once you see that it's worthless.
He had supported merger for the common market because he knew Singapore was too small to be economically viable on its own. We've talked about his views on this in Season 2, Episode 3. But the common market was never implemented. Dr. Goh was having massive fights with Kuala Lumpur over financial issues, and he was so exhausted from this that his health was affected. And during Malaysia's most crucial period, he had to go to a German spa for a rest cure. Now, second, Dr. Goh feared the cost of the violence. Lee argued that the violence was inevitable. And he was right, happened in 1969. So Lee argued they should use the violence to advance their aims. Dr. Goh accepted that violence was inevitable, I think, but did not want to be the person who caused the deaths of so many people. On the contrary, look what he did. The 1964 riots were a sobering lesson that their political strategy had very real consequences. People were going to die if Lee kept following this strategy. And the riots happened, and Dr. Goh responded to those riots by opening the Albatross File. That's how shaken he was by the riots. He immediately started planning on how to get out. Third, remember the issue of detention without trial? As Lee's provocations went on, the PAP ministers grew afraid that they too would be detained. The exhibition mentions that the PAP ministers discussed what to do if they were locked up. But the exhibition does not explain what being locked up meant. Political detainees were being tortured in Singapore at the very same time the ministers were discussing being detained themselves. Okay, trigger warning descriptions of torture. Lim Chin Ju, for example, was detained from 1957 to 1966 and was subjected to, among other things, electric shocks applied to his body, his nipples, his genitals. He was subjected to beatings, to humiliation, to torture. So when the PAP ministers discussed the possibility of being detained themselves, this was not just being locked up. They knew exactly what detention might mean and they were afraid of it. And the ministers recognized that if Lee was detained, all of them would be detained too. If you arrest Lee, you can't leave the rest of the ministers free to agitate and lead resistance to UMNO. The PAP knew this because this is what they had done to the Barisan Socialists. Now, if Lee's strategy was working, perhaps they might have stayed the course, but the problem was that the strategy was not paying off. Both the UMNO and British leadership knew what Lee was trying to do. They weren't stupid. So they were furiously trying to restrain the extremist elements from doing anything rash. But also, consider how it looks to the moderate leaders of UMNO, like the Tunku and Dr. Ismail. Lee is on the record calling Jafar Alba a Malay ultra. But at this point, Lee is saying things as bad as Alba. Privately, UMNO is calling Lee a Chinese ultra. And why should they make concessions to a racist? And they also knew that confrontasi couldn't last, so they were basically trying to run out the clock. And Lee knew they knew, and they knew that Lee knew that they knew. So Lee kept doubling down and tripling down and quadrupling down. He had bet everything on this course of action and gone all in. So the question was, did his colleagues trust that Lee could play a winning hand? And the answer, I think, is no. And that is why Goh chose to fold. Because his colleagues recognized that Lee's judgment was compromised and also his behavior was erratic. See, Lee's own memoir discusses his heavy beer drinking and smoking, but it went beyond that. It's been an established fact in Singapore history since the publication of James Minchin's No Man is an Island in 1986 that Lee Kuan Yew was dangerously dependent on prescription drugs during this period. But for obvious reasons, the official historical narrative leaves this uncomfortable fact out. This all was published in Singapore in 1986 while Lee Kuan Yew was still Prime Minister. But no lawsuit, no defamation, not a word from Lee Kuan Yew contradicting this. Lee was only human. He made mistakes. And that really is the thing that we should also grapple with. During this time, he was 41 years old. By the end of the merger campaign in the 1963 elections, Lee was utterly spent and exhausted. His own recollections refer to the campaign for merger as the most difficult of his political life, grueling and exhausting, and his book is peppered with anecdotes about him needing breaks. So in order to keep functioning, his doctor prescribed him with sedatives to help him sleep, stimulants to help him wake up in the morning, and tranquilizers throughout the day. Throughout the Malaysia period, Lee was under tremendous stress and became heavily dependent on those drugs. This was an open secret in political circles at the time, as one American observer recorded in his report. To put himself to sleep, he takes sedatives. To wake up, he takes pep pills. And during the day, he gulps tranquilizers. Taken together, this evidence explains why his colleagues later described his behavior during the Malaysia campaign as increasingly erratic, and also explains the emotional volatility that his colleagues later recalled, including Lee smiling and laughing before the press conference of 9 August 1965, followed by him famously bursting into tears during the press conference. Toh Chin Chai and Lim Kim San also recalled how Lee's behavior frustrated and puzzled and angered them. Toh Chin Chai remarks how Lee became more and more anti-Malay in his speeches and notes how some of the things Lee said were really insulting. And Lim Kim San, when asked if they asked Lee Kuan Yew to stop his insult, said, yes, we did. But once he got on the podium in front of the crowd, everything would come out. Exactly what we told him not to say, he would say. And if you read between the lines of these quotes, there's a possibility that Lee's most trusted colleagues, the people who had the greatest faith in him, had not been told that his strategy was to deliberately provoke the Malay extremists. Otherwise, why would they counsel Lee not to say these provocative things? And if they didn't know, that means Lee's behavior must have been scaring the hell out of them. So put it all together, and it's clear that Goh Keng Swee was worried about people dying and about himself getting locked up and tortured, and he had lost faith in Malaysia, and he didn't think Lee's strategy was working, and maybe he might have even lost faith in Lee's decision-making. But what can you do? You can't defenestrate Lee. He's your leader. Who would replace him? Who can replace him? Hello! Today we have a letter from Dr. Goh Keng Swee about the feng shui of his house. He writes, I moved into this house because I thought it would give us a better long-term arrangement. A common kitchen and garden means everyone can prosper together. But now the layout is very strange. The house wants our money but does not want us to have equal say in how we spend it. The landlord does not trust us. The other residents are becoming more and more aggressive. And my housemate's solution is to keep provoking everybody until either they change the house rules or the whole house goes into crisis. So my question is, how can I improve the feng shui? Keng Swee, it's too late. At this point, you do not need feng shui. You need a moving company. The lease agreement is contradictory, the chief flow is blocked, the residents are hostile, and your housemate is activating all the conflict corners on purpose. So, do not ask about the mirror, the rug, or the water feature. The only good feng shui solution is not to stay, it is to move out. So, now you know. And so, instead, to avoid what he later called calamity, Goh negotiates separation and presents it to Lee as a fait accompli. And he never said a word to Lee until Lee found out almost 30 years later. So when you have all this context, you understand why Goh decided to defy Lee. And yet, for all his disagreements with Lee, Goh Keng Swee never expressed a word of that in public. His solution was to save Lee from himself. Separation may be seen as Goh Keng Swee's ultimate act of loyalty to his leader and to his friend. The exhibition is a huge disservice to Lee Kuan Yew and to Singapore. So, to conclude, the story of Malaysia from 1961 to 65 is compelling, not because Lee Kuan Yew was flawless, but because he was not. He was brilliant, audacious, manipulative, reckless, and often politically astonishing. And those same qualities that made merger possible, that created Malaysia, also helped destroy it. Malaysia did not simply collapse because UMNO was communal and the PAP was idealistic. It collapsed because Lee accepted a merger built on containment and then immediately tried to overturn the terms on which that containment rested. That made collision structurally inevitable. The real question then is not whether Lee saw this problem. He did. The question is what he was willing to risk to solve it. Think about how 13th May 1969 is such great national trauma for Malaysia. At least 1,000 people died. Lee predicted it. And he wanted to make it happen as soon as possible so that he could use it for political purposes. It's a trolley problem. You're on a trolley, and if you keep going, racism will continue. Malaysia will be a Malay supremacist country. But if you switch tracks, there's an opportunity to create a better, more equal society. But 1,000 people are tied to those tracks and will definitely die. So do you switch tracks? Lee Kuan Yew said yes, switch tracks. But Goh Keng Swee said no. Lee was willing to risk 1,000 lives for the chance, just a chance of a more equal Malaysia, but Goh Keng Swee did not want 1,000 deaths on his conscience, and that's why Goh Keng Swee chose separation. And that is what the exhibition should help people think about. Not some sanitized morality play about good men trapped by circumstance, but a real political tragedy about agency, trade-offs, fear, courage, cost. History is not inevitable. Merger is not destiny. Separation is not fate. These were choices, real choices, trade-offs, argued over, resisted, and made under pressure. And if we want to understand the tragedy of Malaysia, if we want to learn from the past for our future, we have to put those omissions back in. So that's the show. Thanks for watching. Buy my book. We'll be back in a few months with Season 3. See you then.